And we spoke last month, or in the last webinar, might be a little over a month ago, about the basics of directors and officers liability coverage and what happens on the nonprofit particularly. But wanted to go a little bit further into the risks that are associated with the duties of serving on a nonprofit board. And so there is a lot of history where states have had certain restrictions on how much liability volunteers have when they're working for the benefit of a nonprofit organization. However, often that is eroded when it's the board of directors. And so there are still risks. Case law still develops because they are responsible for running the organization. So as we look at the role of the board of directors of board of trustees, it all depends on what the nonprofit says, or what they usually organize as the name of the board members. But at the end of the day, they're still the directors of the organization, and also the officers being the ones who execute on the mission of the organization from a day-to-day basis. They have specific duties and obligations. So first and foremost is setting the strategic direction of the organization, but also they are the central decision-making body. So when looking at what happens, while a corporation is an entity under the law, it's a person under the law, it doesn't direct any of its own actions, and therefore whoever is directing the actions are the responsible parties. So that ultimate responsibility and accountability for the whole organization does fall back to the directors and officers. And the three fundamental duties of a director or officer are the duty of care, duty of loyalty, and duty of obedience. And these three have been developed through case law since the 1960s. And the duty of care is about the business judgment rule, utilizing the standard care that an ordinarily prudent person would use in the same circumstances with the same information. So the duty of loyalty is about doing what's in the best interest of the organization and not in their own self-interest. And there was a movie about this, Extraordinary Measures. Brendan Fraser and Harrison Ford. It was based on a true story where a father who had terminally ill children had to make a decision as the president of an organization which way to go. And one way would have benefited the family more, but would have slowed a drug development, and the other way would have benefited the drug development and all the children that had this terminal illness more quickly. And so I'm not going to spoil the movie, but with that decision out there, you can watch it and see whether or not they made the right decision on the duty of loyalty. And then the duty of obedience. The duty of obedience is the organization, especially for a nonprofit, the directors have to operate within the range that the mission of the organization is, what the bylaws were set up as, and what the IRS has agreed to. If they're tax exempt under the IRS, what the IRS has agreed is their tax exempt status. So when you're looking at those duties, they develop risk. So by the nature of the duties themselves, they actually start imparting risk on the directors and officers, because if they don't have their duty of loyalty and they do something for their own benefit, if they get outside the parameters of what they're supposed to do as their mission and what they've filed as an organization, if they aren't taking care, they're not showing up at board meetings, they're not controlling what's happening in the organization, overseeing it, and providing the strategic direction that they're supposed to, they can incur liability. So figured we would talk a little bit about the duty of care and what it is. And we'll talk about each of the three duties. And then we're also going to talk about what the risks are and some claims that have arisen from them. And then we'll get into some other claims at the end that drift across all three duties. So at the end of the day, sitting on a board of directors for a nonprofit is often something that someone does for benevolent reasons, or they'll do it for, some people will actually do it to say, oh yeah, something that it's great, I could put on my resume. But board members, when they go and work for a nonprofit as a volunteer, because really very few nonprofits are paid board positions, they really, first of all, the nonprofit should want people who are passionate about their cause and are going to be engaged and informed and bring their best judgment to the organization and not just rubber stamp every decision. But secondly, the board members should be thinking about this when they come in and work at that board, because there should be a level of work that goes into being on a board. For the boards I sit on and have sat on in the past, there are financials that are being reviewed. There are decisions being made. There are committees set up, and we are engaged. So it's important to make sure that that board environment is a dynamic environment. It's important that it's an environment that people will throw ideas onto the table, but other people will put counterbalance on that and say, I don't think that's a good idea. I do think that's a good idea. I agree, I disagree. But also the engagement of the board itself as a group should also be some regular interaction. There should be, either the committees are meeting on a regular basis, but the board should meet at least a couple of times a year, preferably multiple times a year. So depending on the size of the organization can often determine the size of the board, but eventually boards can get unwieldy, especially for large charitable organizations. When you look at some of the largest museums in the world, they might have hundreds of board members, but they really only have an executive committee of a dozen or 20 people that are really driving the board decisions, and the other people are major benefactors that are part of the fundraising efforts. But when you're in that group that's actually setting the direction as either the executive committee or as part of a board that is an active board, because it's not so large, it's unwieldy, it's important to be in that decision-making process as if it were the decision-making processes in any other major decision if you weren't in just with another group of people. And so what do I mean by that? If you were to take that action, if it was your business, would you take the same action, or would you say, that's not an action I want to take? And those are the kind of judgments that the board members should be making. So when you look at the trustees being engaged and informed, here's an interesting law scenario. So nonprofit has a fundraising event, and in order to tide them over, because most nonprofits, their fundraising events actually get them into the black, and so they don't have the money up front for them, they took a loan out, but the funds were mismanaged. They were actually used to pay operating expenses, and they should have been used to take care of the fundraising event. Well, at the end of the day, they filed for bankruptcy, and when the lawsuit came through from the organization they loaned the money from, it was failure to supervise, breach of their duty of care. So one of the things we've seen in case law is the courts are actually asking at times, I'd like to see the minutes and see who objected. Was there any discussion on this, or was this just rubber stamped? And so that's become a theme when you're looking at it. And bankruptcy courts go back and they look to see whether or not there's anyone who was part of that decision-making process that maybe didn't do their due diligence. So moving on to the duty of loyalty, it's really important that acting in the best interest of the organization and the mission is a critical component of of board membership. It's also a critical part of being an officer of an organization. So there are, and that's set by case law. It's 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 simply part of how the law is developed around the claims that have developed over time. So it's important to have everyone acting in the best interest of the organization, but it's also important today, especially, to have a lot of transparency. And so the boards that have the nonprofits that have the most transparency, often they're the ones that can get the most grant money. They can get the most philanthropists who are interested in what they're doing. Philanthropists want to see controls in place, so back to the duty of care, but they want to see transparency of how things are going and where things are going and how they're actually fulfilling their mission. But the key being that they need to act in the best interest of the organization. So when you look at this law scenario, there's a situation where it was a great article, and I wish I still had a copy of it, but I've lost it through the years. And a board declared bankruptcy, and the local newspaper actually published all the self-dealing. And here are just a few examples of the self-dealing by the board members. And the board members actually were making more money on it than if they had gone out to a bidding process, and the board members weren't the ones who were doing some of the services for the organization. So this was all listed, and the name of the board member and what they had done, and whether or not that was competitive in the market was all researched in this article. And whether it's accurate or not doesn't matter that much. If they hadn't gone bankrupt and this had been published, what do you think would have happened to their donations? They probably would have dropped. So transparency is important, because when something isn't transparent, it just gives fuel to the speculation that it was intentionally something that was being hidden and tucked away, where it could be simply an oversight. So the bankruptcy trustee ended up looking at it and deciding to investigate the conflicts of interest. And so you've got these situations where if someone's running a conflict of interest with an organization, it can come back to haunt them at the end of the day, and it's a risk for insureds. So the third duty, the duty of obedience. So for corporations, it's being obedient to their shareholders when they're publicly traded, privately traded, and you see activist shareholders getting something onto the proxy statement for a vote by the shareholders that some insurance companies should actually do something about getting potable water for people in sub-Saharan Africa. Those are the kinds of things that you'll see in the public corporation, and if the shareholders voted for it, they would have to actually try to do something about potable water in sub-Saharan Africa. But on a nonprofit basis, the duty of obedience is, again, staying with the mission, staying with what they've filed for as the operations that they're going to be running with whoever it is that granted them tax-exempt status. And it's important to be appointing who's running the operation, reviewing the bylaws, making sure the organization stays aligned with them, and doing the strategic planning all within that framework. So here are two loss scenarios from the duty of obedience. The first, and these are both member organizations, so what is interesting about this is member organizations are very similar to publicly traded organizations or privately traded organizations, where votes come in and then there's an obedience requirement. And so with homeowners associations or condo owners associations, often votes come through and the organization, the directors and officers, are expected to fulfill whatever the vote is from the members. So in this particular one, it was about tournaments utilizing the homeowners facilities inside the association, and it was voted against by the homeowners, and the board ended up getting sued when the board said, we're going to keep holding these tournaments because we like holding them and we've got the facilities and it's worthwhile. The second scenario is interesting because also a membership organization, but it's for unions. And some of this was actually publicized, where unions were sued because they were donating to political campaigns, and the members brought suit saying that that was outside of the scope of the mission, and they didn't have the members' permission to be spending money that way that wasn't a direct benefit to the members. So whether or not anything settles out of any of these suits, or there's a judgment against the organizations, there's defense costs. And so many nonprofits just are on a shoestring budget that they can't afford defense costs. Now, while we had the three duties broken down, and they're all fiduciary duties of the directors and officers and the trustees, a lot of things actually cross over all three, or they'll cross over two of the three, or they're just generally a breach of a fiduciary duty. And so this is an example where a nonprofit, again, with regard to a concert event, hosting a fundraising event, they ended up getting funding for that from an outside organization, this time being the government. They ended up with the expenses being far beyond the revenues received, and it turned out that after the government decided to look into it a little closer, they felt that they misappropriated the funds. So one of the things too about nonprofits, if someone delegates funds for a specific thing and you use them for something else, then that's a violation. It can cost you your tax status. It can cost a lawsuit for the misappropriation of funds, and people can actually donors can ask to have the funds back. So basically, the claim ended up being resolved after having considerable defense costs spent, but it's a breach of their fiduciary duty on the part of the directors and officers. And another one, here's a situation with a professional association. So professional associations have a little bit of a unique exposure in the nonprofit world. Often a professional association will set accrediting standards or will set disciplining standards for their members, especially if their members are accredited by the organization. And so this was a situation where the board of directors was sued by a member, and because the way that they were conducting the membership revocation, it wasn't clearly laid out in the bylaws. And so it ended up becoming a challenge that really expanded the length and duration and cost of the lawsuit. So when you're looking at the various aspects of an organization, a nonprofit, there's a lot of risk for directors and officers that they can end up with a suit. And even if they're not individually named or the board's not named specifically, the organization itself can struggle to actually have the funds to be able to pay for the defense costs, let alone for any settlements or judgments that may have to come along. And that's where the directors and officers policy often is overlooked, because people are thinking they can rely on the state protections for volunteers. So at this point, thank you again for attending, but we'll open it up for questions, and we can actually, I think we're going to actually have to close it off for questions, because the person who receives the questions for me and feeds them is leaving for an alarm right now in our main office, and I'm remote. So thank you for attending. If you do have any questions, please don't hesitate to email us. You can email me at matt.kletzli@victorinsurance.com, and we look forward to speaking with you on the next webinar. Thanks, everyone.